Hey there. If you have a true scary story that you'd like to hear featured on the channel, then go to mariesfield.com and send it my way. And of course, thank you. I have been a police officer for somewhere close to a decade and have spent a significant portion of my career out on the road and making sure that people out there aren't doing anything too crazy. For the most part, the job is pretty boring, which I guess is one of those don't look a gift horse in the mouth kind of things. If my job wasn't boring, it would be a lot more dangerous. I pretty much just drive around and make sure people aren't breaking the law or respond to calls that come in nearby. I've had a few run-ins with crazy situations, sure, but really for the most part, everything is fairly routine. That all holds true until you get thrown into the night shift. The minute you get in the car and out onto the road after the sun goes down, things get a bit more hectic and a lot more unpredictable. Things do have a certain level of standard. However, there are far more moments where things do get out of hand. Most nights involve calls where people think that someone is in their home, or people calling to say that the neighbors left their garage door open, but some of the things you run into do absolutely get crazy. There was one night that I was driving on my patrol and things were going pretty standard. I had issued a couple tickets and responded to one or two calls that were pretty uneventful. I then got a call and was asked to check out a business alarm at a local strip mall and was headed out toward the alarm when I saw what looked like a young child standing on the side of the road. I slowed my car down and made sure that I wasn't just going crazy or seeing things, and sure enough, on the side of the highway on-ramp, there was a small child that couldn't have been much older than 6 or 7. I pulled over and grabbed my radio, calling in that I was stopping at a potential emergency, informing them that there was a child out near the highway and that they would need to send someone else to the business alarm. They asked if I needed more units at my location, and I informed them that I wasn't sure at the moment. Obviously, we're trained to keep calm in situations like this and to try and control ourselves, but my mind was honestly racing. It was a bit after midnight at this point. Why was there a child walking on the road by the highway? Where were his parents? Was this a runaway situation? I flicked my lights on to try and get the kid's attention and jumped out to go find him. As soon as I got out onto the shoulder of the road, I heard the kid sobbing somewhere a bit back. I sped up my pace and called out to see if the kid would run over to me once I got his attention. The second that he heard my voice shout over to him, I could hear him crying louder and yelling out to me asking for help. This made me jump into action more than I already had. The kid being out there was confusing at first, for sure. But instead of him just being there and upset, he was now calling out for help. This told me that something else was going on here. As I ran back toward where the kid was, I called into my radio for dispatch to send a second unit to this location and to have medical on standby just in case. When I got over to the little boy and knelt down to try and ask what was going on, I noticed that he had blood on his shirt and looked a little cut up. The poor kid was just sitting there sobbing and yelling something incoherently. I let him get it out a bit before I told him to calm down and asked him what was going on. After a bit of back and forth, he started saying things that made sense but were dreadful to hear. The first thing he said that I was able to make sense of was car crash. As soon as those words came out of his mouth, my ears perked up and I was starting to piece things together. I asked him if he was in a car crash with his parents, and he again nodded, and then mentioned that his dad was driving and they got into an accident. This is what I was expecting, and honestly, not wanting to hear. I grabbed my radio and told the dispatch to get medical out here. As I was calling it in, my backup pulled up to the scene. As he approached, I told him that we may have an accident with an unconscious occupant somewhere, and that the occupant was likely to be this child's father. I went back to the little boy and I asked him if the accident happened nearby and if he could show me. He said yes, and then pointed over toward where there was a ravine by the entry ramp. I stood up and walked over toward where the dip was and shined my light down into the ditch, and sure enough, there was a small Ford lying upside down at the bottom. This is where things really jumped into motion. I called over to the other officer and informed him to take the child out, call for more backup, and get medical down into the ravine as soon as they got there, and told them that there was a vehicle down in the ravine. From here, it was mostly adrenaline, and I don't remember everything that happened. The most that I recall was that I ran down into the ditch and searched the car and saw an unconscious man buckled into the driver's seat. I know that I was pulling at the door and trying everything I could to get him out of the car, and then medical showed up and took over. At the end, as things got pieced together and it all fell into place, I learned what exactly happened. Apparently, this man had to go somewhere and he didn't want to leave his son home alone, so he decided that he wanted to take him with him. Unfortunately, with it being as late as it was, he was apparently starting to doze off while driving and did so while heading up the on-ramp. When he did, he ended up going over the side and flipping his car down the ravine. Thankfully, in some miracle from above, when the car flipped, neither of them were killed. The father had some moderate injuries, a concussion, and his son had a few scratches, scrapes, and bruises, but nothing that was life-threatening. Like I said, it would have to have been a miracle that neither of them were killed or seriously injured, and I'm beyond glad of the fact that I happened to be driving by at the exact moment I needed to be. However, I think that this experience should hold strong as a testament for why you should never get on the road while you're tired unless absolutely necessary. In this situation, no one was seriously hurt, but I have absolutely seen wrecks at night where the people weren't so lucky. As an officer, I have to say, please be careful out there and make sure that you are awake and aware when you get behind the wheel. This happened many years ago, but it was such a terrifying moment for me that I still remember it vividly. Back when I was about 13 or 14, my family, which consisted of my parents, me, my little sister, and our dog, had to live in a hotel for about a month while our home was being repaired due to flooding. Being a teenage girl at the time, spending most of my time in the same room as my parents was not my idea of fun. Thankfully, I was able to bring some of my stuff to keep me entertained, and there was also a pool so I could go swimming whenever I wanted to. However, it was also a prime opportunity to stay over with friends because they rarely told me no. I wish I would have stayed with someone on this particular day though. That way I could have just avoided this whole situation. It was a Saturday, and while my dad still worked, my mom was home with me and my sister until she needed to run errands. I was not interested at that time with having to go to a bunch of places, as I knew I would probably just get stuck with watching my sister, so I asked if I could stay at the hotel. After a few pleas, she reluctantly agreed, telling me not to answer the door for anyone as she would have a key. Dad left his in the room in case we needed it, since Mom was always back before he got home. She did say I could go to the pool since I had been down there to swim by myself before. So after the list of do's and don'ts, she finally left. I probably stayed in the room for about an hour or so, playing my DS and watching TV until I started getting bored. Since I could only use the hotel phone for emergencies, my mom had her cell phone and the hotel charged for phone calls. My next plan was to go swimming for a bit. I changed into my swimsuit and put my cover up on, then left the room with nothing but a towel and the room key. Thankfully, there weren't many people there. There was a woman with her baby and a kid, maybe a few years younger than me, playing, then a group of 4 old people in the hot tub talking. Lastly, there was a guy sitting close to the back doors working on some kind of puzzle book. I had wrapped my room key in my towel and set it on one of the chairs off to the side, hoping no one would bother it since I was leaving my cover up on it as well. I had seen multiple people grab towels from anywhere nearby the towel cart they kept in there, so I was always worried that they would take mine by mistake, and I would lose my room key. I got in the pool by taking the stairs, which was where the mom and kids were hanging out, and slowly walked over to the deeper side. I liked going over there and either just floating around or swimming back and forth to each side. However, the deeper I went, the closer I got to the guy with the puzzle book. That's how I noticed he was staring at me. When I would come up for air or just glance over, he was always looking at me and would just smile. After the first time, though, I stopped smiling. I may have been shy, but something about his smile was unsettling. I tried my best to just have fun, but that feeling in my stomach was not going away. I think the mom in the pool even noticed as I would look around at anything I could just to stop myself from looking at him, and I noticed how she kept looking past her baby at him. That feeling would then intensify when I noticed the guy stand up and start walking towards the pool. And of all the places to get into the pool, the stairs or the ladder on the deepest side, he chose to stop and sit on the edge of the pool with his feet dangling in it, right where I was. After he sat down, the only thing he said was, "Hey, young lady, mind if I jump in?" The words may have been innocent, but it was something about his inflection and the way he said it that nearly gave me a panic attack. I was at a loss of words, or even action to take, so I just looked away and swam to the other side of the pool and jumped over the edge to get out. My chair was close to the door, so I quickly grabbed it all, and without even trying to dry off or put on my cover, I swung open that door and rushed out of there. I know that may have already seemed like someone who was in a hurry or something, but I thought I would just fast walk to the elevator to get there quicker, but also not look like I was running away, I guess. I was 14. I didn't know what to do. However, that feeling in my gut intensified again when I heard the pool door open and out walks the same guy. You just went to get into the pool. Why would you be leaving it and your stuff behind? Tell me that doesn't scream you're trying to follow someone. So I picked up the pace and ran to the elevator, jamming the button until it finally opened. But this guy was still pretty close behind me, and now waving and yelling for me to hold the elevator. Like hell I was going to do that, so I started jamming the button to close the door faster. I figured if I could get in the elevator alone, it would be safer than taking the stairs that were enclosed and risking someone not be able to see or possibly hear me if something did happen. I didn't factor in the odds of him being capable of catching up to me, stopping the elevator, and being in an enclosed metal box with me, which was exactly what happened. My heart was pounding. I stood as close as I could to the door, but with my back against the wall, so that way he wasn't behind me and was within my vision. That's when he started going on about how rude it was for me to not hold the door for someone, especially when they asked you to. He just seemed incredibly angry for something so simple, and also towards a child. That startled me even more. I didn't know what else to do but clutched my stuff closer to my chest and remained quiet. When he realized he wasn't getting a response from me, he started asking about what room I was in and if I was alone or if my parents knew where I was. This was already causing anxiety to pile up, but then I realized that he never pushed the button on the elevator. I did. So now I was worried he at least knew what floor I was on. So as soon as it stopped and the doors were just open enough to fit my small self through, I took off. I was terrified of the thought of him once again catching up to me, and what if he did as I was entering the room? My mom probably wasn't back yet, so I would be alone. So trying to think fast, I ran as far as I could to the end of the hall and started banging on a random door, hoping for the best. I remember shouting, "Dad, I forgot my key, open the door." While looking back, I noticed the guy was still coming towards me, but at a slower pace. What I wasn't expecting was an actual older man in his boxers and a shirt to open the door and look at me confused. I again was hesitant about running in this room, so I just looked down and softly said, "There's a man following me." I apparently said it loud enough for him to hear as he walked out of the room shouting, "What kind of grown man is following around little girls?" The creep was standing at the room a few doors down and had just looked over at us. The older man started approaching him and confronted him, again asking why he was following me, when the guy said there was obviously a misunderstanding. He claimed he was just trying to get to his room, which happened to be on the same floor I went to, and it must have scared me. I guess I was feeling a little brave, so I mentioned him being at the pool and what he said in the elevator. The old man actually stuck around and told him he better go to his room. The creep patted down his pockets and wiggled the doorknob and looked back at us and said, "Huh, I must have dropped my key," and walked off back towards the elevator. I still highly doubt that was actually his room, and he was just standing by to see what happened. I felt the old man was pretty close to knocking that guy out. After he was out of sight, the man started asking me if I knew that guy and what happened, and while we were talking, a lady and a kid walked out of their room. I assumed it was like a grandparents and grandkid situation. They then walked me to my room, which was actually around the corner, about midway down the hall. When I got there, my mom ended up coming back shortly after. I told her what had happened, and she immediately went to inform the front desk. Unfortunately, the only part I really know about that was that they told my mom they would check who was in that room and get back with her if they found out anything. The thing is, we were there for another week, and daily, my mom would ask them and they wouldn't tell her anything. They had a bit of an argument at that point, and whoever was there at the time told my mom that it wouldn't make a difference because since they didn't actually do anything to me, they couldn't kick them out if they already paid. This made my parents angry enough that we ended up leaving that hotel and went to another one for the rest of our time. So we never did see the creep again, thankfully. I don't know what his actual intentions were, but I try not to think about that stuff. I just avoid being alone in places like hotels or where there may not be a lot of people or witnesses around from then on. I just hope he was never able to terrorize another kid like that again. I have always been an avid gardener, or at least I think that's the word for it. I'm not one that actually does things like fruits or vegetables, but I always had a green thumb when it comes to flowers and bushes and such. I've always found joy and peace in cultivating plants and spending time outside during the early days of spring. When I lived at the apartment complex that I lived at, my mother was actually a property manager for the location, and I worked with them to create the flower bed for the main office. I used my own money and took weeks to actually get everything built and planted, and in the end, the landscaping could only be described as award-winning. Yes, I'm talking myself up, but also, it was that damn good. When I bought my first home, I couldn't wait to personalize my front yard and create this beautiful and welcoming atmosphere for everyone who passed by. My house was quite small. I was the only one living there, and it was perfect for me. The yard was big and open, and there was a huge spot open on both sides of the porch that I knew I could make look really good. Little did I know, my green thumb dream would lead to a nightmarish encounter with a neighbor that I can only describe as an absolute nutcase. I will say that the day I moved in, I had encountered a few neighbors that were great, and one neighbor that was a bit off. The first encounter I had with that neighbor, I was moving my boxes and furniture into my house, my brother helping. It was around noon and we were dutifully moving stuff in, and she came over to the yard and just stood there watching us. After a few moments, I waved and went to introduce myself, and instead of shaking my hand, she asked if we were almost done because we were making too much noise. At this point, I knew for a fact that she was just another Karen that I saw on the internet. This may not seem important, but it helps to demonstrate who this neighbor was. Back to the house and gardening, I decided that I wanted to plant some bushes in front of the windows on both sides of the porch. I decided that they should add charm and character. After a bit of thinking on it, I opted to plant a beautiful mix of azaleas and hydrangeas, opting to mix the warm colors of the azaleas with the cool and white tones from the hydrangeas. These bushes were, in my opinion, eye-catching and would look gorgeous as they bloomed. Of course, what I thought would be gorgeous were a blight to my local Karen. One weekend, I had spent most of the morning planting the bushes and had gotten through about half of them when Karen walked over to my yard and again just stood there staring at me. I noticed her, looked back and waved, then went right back to it, assuming that not engaging would be enough to get rid of her. Of course, it wasn't though. She walked right up into my yard and asked, "Why are you planting those hideous bushes?" I paused looking at these cute little unassuming plants, thinking, how are they hideous? I mentioned that I liked them and that when they were grown and bloomed, they would have a ton of really pretty colors. She told me that they were ugly, and I asked why she would judge them before she saw what they looked like when fully grown. She stared at me angrily for a few silent seconds and then said, "You need to get rid of them." I laughed, literally laughed at this suggestion. I asked her if she knew how much money I had spent on these bushes, sarcastically of course, and then went immediately back to pushing dirt around the bush. She scoffed at me and then said, "If you don't get rid of them, I'll get rid of them for you." I stopped, stood up, and looked her face to face. At this point, I was pretty upset, and I was done dealing with this woman. I looked her square in the eyes and said, "I'd like to see you try. Now get off my property before I call the police and have you trespassed, and I really don't want to do that my first week living here." Apparently, this was the worst thing I could have said because try and succeed, she did. It was about a week after the incident with Karen in the front yard and would have been within the first 2 weeks of me living in the house. I was lying in bed, completely passed out, when I was tugged out of my slumber slightly by a beeping noise. I instinctively reached over to smack my alarm clock, but after hitting it probably a dozen times, I noticed that the beeping wasn't stopping. It was then that I realized it wasn't my alarm clock that was waking me up. It was my upstairs smoke alarm. As this clicked, the smell of burning wood crept its way into my nose, and it all came together. Panic set in as I stumbled out of bed, fumbling with my phone to call 911. Disoriented, confused, and slightly choking on the smoke, I ran out the back door just in time to see that the smoke was on the front of the house. I ran through the gate to the front yard, and sure enough, the front of my house was burning. As I was explaining to the 911 operator that my house was on fire, I glanced over across the street and who should I see but Karen, sitting on her front porch and sipping on a cup of coffee while smiling and waving at me. My heart dropped when the realization hit me. She had deliberately set my house on fire, all because of a few bushes. Thankfully, the fire department arrived in time to put the fire out, and the damage wasn't as extensive as it could have been, but my sense of security was gone, replaced by a deep-rooted fear that someone so close to my home could harbor such malice over something as simple as not liking the bushes I was planting. As I was standing there talking to the firefighters about the whole thing, I was approached by another neighbor, specifically the neighbor that lived directly next to me. He asked if I was okay. I told him I was and explained that the damage wasn't too bad. And he followed that up with, "I called the police to come out already, but I wanted to show you something." I was a bit confused at first, but why he approached me became very clear very quickly. He showed me his phone and mentioned that he had a security camera that faced out the front window and that it actually picked everything up. Right there on his screen, I could clearly see Karen walking across the road with a gas can toward my house. You couldn't see her actually pouring the gas or starting the fire, but you could see her approach and then see the fire start lighting up the street and see her running back toward her house and standing there watching it burn. The look on her face was horrifying. Even in the slightly pixelated footage, you could tell that she was laughing and see that she was actually clapping and jumping up and down as she celebrated her victory. She then ran back to her house and came back out a few minutes later with her coffee and just sat there watching her handiwork. Thankfully, the footage was pretty clear and she was wearing the same clothes as she was sitting on the porch. The cops arrived and asked her a few questions, and we showed them the footage. The whole situation was pretty clear. She'd committed arson. When the police went over to talk to her about things, she tried to claim that she had been home all morning, that she never left, and when she was questioned about why she smelled like gasoline, she literally told them that she liked the smell and that that wasn't a crime. They arrested her for what she'd done, determining that there was enough evidence to actually take her in for arson. The repairs were costly and took a while, and I had to move back in with my mom for a while until it was all done. I couldn't live in a house that was partially charred like that. Obviously, my bushes were lost to the flames as they were the main target, but I took solace in knowing that Karen wasn't going to be a threat to myself or anyone else. When I was able to move back into the house, I did install a Ring camera, and I actually went ahead and planted new bushes in the same spots. And now, when they bloom, I'm reminded of that image of seeing Karen cuffed and shoved into the back of a police car. I've been a trucker for most of my adult life. It's a fulfilling career if you like to be out on the open road, and I chose it for that exact reason. I wanted to see the country. I wanted to drive out in the middle of nowhere and just kind of be by myself. It can be lonely work, sure, but I think that's why I like it. I've never really been much of a people person. I could probably talk for hours about the psychology of why I like being alone, probably some trauma in my childhood or something. But really, I think I'd rather just tell you about the one time I almost quit being a trucker. This happened back in the early 2000s, somewhere around 2003 or 2004. I was in my mid-30s at the time, and I had been driving a semi for a mid-sized shipping company for around 5 or so years. Back then, and even now, I was always super careful with how I managed myself when I was working. I never went over my driving hours, I always slept when I was supposed to, and I made sure that I was in a good way before I got on the road. I'd seen a few truckers make some major mistakes when they were tired, and I wasn't going to end up one of them. I was also good about my caffeine intake, limiting myself in the mornings so I didn't become reliant on it. I never drank or took any substances, and I was always super careful when out on the road, kept my distance from other cars, and followed the laws. That all said, for some reason, there are people out there that just do not seem to understand that my giant motor vehicle takes a significant amount more distance to stop than your average car. I'll never understand why people decide they want to cut us off on the highway with almost literally no space or distance between us, or drive in what is obviously a blind spot for our truck. Apologies for rambling a bit in the story. I just want to put it out there that us truckers do our best to control our vehicles, but we need everyone else to pay attention and be a bit more cautious when passing or driving around us. So, this specific event is one that really messed me up, for reasons that'll be obvious here soon. But it was one that made no sense to me. It was early spring here in the US. I was driving through part of the Midwest, which had been particularly dry. When we have dry winters here, the first rains of spring can be particularly dangerous, as all the dried oil and grime on the road starts to seep upwards to the surface, causing major slick spots, almost like black ice. It had rained that morning before I got on the road, so I knew I needed to be extra cautious when driving on parts of the highway that only have 2 lanes. I saddled up, got out into the road, and was driving at a good pace when I saw a vehicle in my side view with a driver that looked agitated. I think that's the best way to put it. I saw him only for a moment when I glanced at the mirror, noted the fact on his face, and braced myself for the potential of him doing something stupid. Side note, you can tell a lot by the look someone has on their face, and this includes whether or not they're going to be aggressive on the road. It's something I've picked up along the way. So, I knew this car was going to be trouble, and my first instinct was to let him pass me, so let off the gas a bit and slowed down so he would have enough room to get ahead. I look over at him as he drives by me, and much to my surprise, this guy is flipping me off and screaming something that I obviously cannot hear. I shake my head and look forward, thinking it's best to just ignore him and move on. I watch him get slightly ahead of me, but still at a point where the rear end of his van is adjacent to my truck. I think he's going to pass way too close, but lo and behold, he tries to swerve over into me, as in he tries to hit me with the back end of his vehicle. I see it in time, and I pull slightly into the shoulder thinking, my God, what is this guy's problem? At this point, on this stretch of road, there really aren't any other vehicles around. It's just me and this guy. So I pull to the right, slow down a bit to let him get ahead of me a few feet, then pull back onto the road within a few seconds. At this point, he's ahead of me a couple car lengths, so I assume that he's going to move on and be an idiot elsewhere. I wish that was what he did, because instead, he started hitting his brakes and slowing down, so I started doing the same. There was a bit of back and forth between him and I, speeding up and slowing down, to the point where I was actually getting annoyed. Then, that annoyance turned into immediate panic and terror. Instead of just slightly slowing his car down, he actually slammed on the brakes of his car. At this point, I was already back up to a decent speed because I didn't think much was going to happen beyond his little slow down speed up. I slammed my brakes as best I could and attempted to roll to the right to minimize this collision, because that's what's going to happen. It was going to be a collision no matter what I did. As I mentioned earlier though, the road was somewhat slick, and slamming my brakes, shifting to the side, I ended up clipping his van at an angle that caused it to flip and drag in front of me. I just did everything I could to control the situation and tried to cause minimal damage. The unfortunate truth was that there was no way for me to minimize this damage. With how we'd connected with the road conditions, and with the fact that I later learned he wasn't wearing a seatbelt when the van flipped, he was actually thrown around to the passenger side of the vehicle and eventually thrown out through the broken windshield of his van. When all was said and done, I was calling this situation in, and I thought I was going to black out. I felt like throwing up and crying all at the same time. Part of me had this awful feeling like this crash was fatal. After the police got there and the medics, I talked them through what had happened. I had a very clunky dash camera that recorded footage for something like 20 minutes at a time. I made sure to stop so it had the footage. I gave it to the police and my supervisor for their internal investigation, and I was cleared of all fault for the accident. But I knew deep down in my heart that this was partially my doing. This man had some sort of manic episode or something because he was acting irrational and crazy, and the unfortunate situation of timing left him in front of me at that exact moment. I have no idea why he was acting that way. I have no idea what was going through his mind when he thought it was a good idea to slam his brakes in front of me like this, but I know that his death has weighed on my conscience since that day. I have had nightmares reliving this situation. I've lost sleep over the fact that I couldn't prevent it, and I've been actually seeing a therapist to try and get past it, because it's coming up on the 20th anniversary this year, and it still eats at me. I want to end this story with the word of caution to people that drive carelessly out there. Please stop. When you get behind the wheel of your 2-ton death machine and drive like an idiot, you are putting everyone around you at risk. And I highly recommend you drop the antics when you're driving around semis, because you may feel invincible out on the road, but I can guarantee you that you are not. So that, my friends, was another collection of scary stories, and we redid the cop one from our last, or 2 videos ago rather, since something weird happened. I don't know what. Raven doesn't know what happened. I don't know what happened, but that's okay. We can redo it. So hopefully you guys got to enjoy it this time. And if you did enjoy this video, please do give it a like below. And if you'd like to hear more content like this, and you aren't already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And lastly, don't forget to leave a comment on your thoughts, or let me know what's going on for you. Anything new? Anything exciting? I know I talked about it the last couple of videos about our anniversary, which was on the 10th, and that was a good weekend. My niece, she actually, her birthday is on the 10th as well, at the day of our anniversary, so easy to remember, yay. But we went out to a park with them, which was at like a conservation type place, which was really neat because they had a young snapping turtle that they were just roaming around in the fields, and it was very hard not to try and pet him, but I did enjoy watching him try to run away and try to bury in the mud. That was interesting. But then we went to the arboretum that was actually for our anniversary, which was also fun. Got to walk the trails and everything. They had goats out there this time because apparently they were supposed to be grazing on the parts that they couldn't get to. But whenever we saw them, they were all just relaxing. So I guess it was their break time. So I got to see some goats, which was nice. We got to see a big, I think we determined it to be a wolf spider that had, it was very much a mother because she was carrying about her, hundreds of babies on her back, which was kind of creepy, but also really cool. I don't know how you guys feel about spiders, but maybe something I consider sharing those pictures of, because it was big. And yeah, I'm glad it wasn't on me, at least. But anyway, that was our last couple of weekends. So how about yours? How was yours? In the meantime, I hope you guys have a fantastic week. And until next time, take care.